How you doing, guys? This is Eric from RuleTheWasteland.com. Video is another of my watching a movie and pointing out the survival and prepping lessons that can be learned from the movie. Except this time, it's also a Prepper Trifecta video, which means J.J. Johnson of Reality Survival and Che of Prepper Logic will also be doing their thoughts and / review of this movie and the lessons, the thoughts, however they want to do it. The movie is one of the classics, Red Dawn from 1984. Good year, awesome movie. The original. There was some talk of doing the new one. I vetoed that one. I said we got to do the original. As always, this is obviously fictional work, so I don't need to hear any people complaining about how unrealistic things may be. Although, for the most part, there's nothing too incredibly unrealistic other than maybe the general premise of the U.S. being invaded by Cuba and Russia, especially in today's climate. But you can still learn from watching these things, thinking what you might do in the scenario, what you might do or need to have done to be prepared for similar situations. So with that being said, let's just get right into it. And also, I always need to mention that if you're a fan of movie reviews in general, I have another movie podcast. It's strictly movies, not preparedness related, that I do with my girlfriend called Faint Praise, where we review usually bad movies. Link to that will be in the description as well. This movie, though, Red Dawn, has one of the kind of coolest intros, which also represents one of the purest kind of bug out scenarios in pretty much any movie that I can think of, where you immediately pretty much have to leave. You can't go home. They're at school, and set in Colorado, and enemy troops start parachuting in. Very cool scene, very iconic scene, and also, like I mentioned, just a really pure bug out scenario. Shows you that there are potential scenarios, however low probability they may be, where you don't even have a chance to go home. Your get home bag may become your pure bug out bag. That may be all you have is literally what you have with you. So that means it's important to try to have some sort of self-defense, some sort of life-sustaining food, water, shelter, all that kind of stuff with you as much of the time as possible, because obviously this scenario is a little bit extreme, but there's other things that could happen. There was like a propane explosion or a train derailment that could have exploded and leveled the whole town in Wayuega, Wisconsin, I believe it was, at one point. And so there are situations where you might not be able to go home. You just literally have to leave. So that represents a pretty pure bug out scenario. They aren't able to go home at all. And I think that's really cool. And, really gets in mind thinking about what you would do in that situation. Another thought is that the Jed character, played by Patrick Swayze, because the movie centers around two brothers, which are Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze. He drops his brother off at school. The Charlie Sheen character, they're literally in class for like a few minutes, and enemy troops just start coming in, start shooting up the principal and everything like that. And so there's a couple things we can see that really are kind of applicable to a bunch of different scenarios, and that is usually how there's a gap between when something's happening, some sort of bad event, and people realizing how serious it is. You see the teacher or the principal, I guess he's just a teacher, walk outside and confront all these military people hastily setting up machine guns and stuff, and just asking them kind of like, hey, what's going on, and getting shot to death. And you think you really need to have a better ability to kind of recognize when things are a little bit out of the ordinary, and you didn't recognize that these weren't American troops, that they obviously weren't doing some kind of training exercise, that this was a serious situation. Shouldn't have just walked out there. He got killed for his efforts, obviously. From that point on, everyone else obviously knew. They saw him get shot. The troops immediately started shooting other students and shooting up the school. So they know stuff is serious at that point. Jed character comes roaring back in with what's, at least for the time, a pretty good bug out vehicle. A big, presumably 4x4 pickup truck, but maybe not 4x4. And he grabs people, has people jump in the back, and just has to take off. And that's pretty much what you have to do in a situation like that. You just have to get the hell out of there. One of the things that the Charlie Sheen character does is he tackles one of the Soviet invaders. Doesn't take the AK-47, which that was a huge mistake. At that point, though, obviously forgivable. They're just trying to get the hell out of there. They don't know what's going on. But if you tackle somebody, take them down, and the gun falls out of their hand, you'd be damn sure I'd be grabbing that gun, or at least kicking it away from them or something. But yeah, I would want to have my hands on it for sure. So that's something I would have done if I was him, and I had my wits about me, which in a situation like that, pretty wild. You're hoping that you will, but until it happens, you never really know for sure. That's one of the advantages of kind of brainstorming, game planning about this stuff ahead of time, is that your mind has at least created that neural pathway so that it'll be that much quicker going through it when the situation might arise in real life or something similar to it. Another scene that I really like in the beginning of the movie, a quick shot, is it shows the bumper sticker that was been popular for many years. It said, "You can have my gun when you pry it from my cold dead fingers." And then it pans down to the guy with his, I think it's a 1911, and he's dead. And the Soviet guy steps on his hand and pries the gun out of his cold dead fingers. And I don't think it's done to be mocking. It's a little bit ironic, I guess, but it shows you that sometimes you don't always win. Sometimes you're just going to go out in a blaze of glory, and you have to make that decision on what you're going to do. Are you going to give up, or are you willing to literally have them take the gun out of your cold dead hands? Don't just say that as a platitude. Make that decision ahead of time about what you're going to do. And I think that's an important thought process to go through, because if you haven't thought about that stuff ahead of time, when it comes time, if it ever does, hopefully it won't, but if that a situation like that ever arises, it's at the very least going to cause hesitation, which you don't want. And if worse, it could cause paralysis or cause you to do something, very counterproductive. So there may come a time when the only choice is to give up completely or go out in sort of semi-blaze of glory, Butch Cassidy style. So think about that sort of thing, and that comes up in this movie sort of a couple times, but certainly that's the most dramatic in-your-face example of that is in that opening scene. So I apologize if I am talking weird. I've had some kind of plague for the past few days, so I'm having to do short cuts of this because I really can't talk for more than a few minutes at a time without my throat getting all clogged up and everything. But what follows next in the movie is one of my favorite types of scenes in any sort of apocalypse, disaster, shit the fan movie, and that's where it's the initial stages, and you got to try and grab all the stuff you can, from a store or something like that. They drive out of town with Jed and Matt, which are the two brothers, and a few of the other high school kids, 5 or 6 other kids, all boys, and they stop at like a kind of a hunting supply store, not an Army Navy store, but something similar to that. Hunting, camping, outdoor gear, gas station, everything kind of all in one general store that is the father of one of the kids. They tell him what's happening. They see the jets and stuff going. The father realizes everything's serious, and he tells him to go in there and get all the supplies you can. So they're throwing everything in the car. And one of the kids says, "Grab some TP. I ain't using leaves," which is obviously a good thing to have. Good, smart decision there. If they throw a bunch of ammo, they grab bow and arrows. Smart thing again. Obviously, the guns and ammunition is important. They're grabbing sleeping bags. So all in all, they do a pretty good job. So it shows them getting knives. They get a pretty good set of gear, canned goods, everything like that. The one thing it does show them is throwing some flats of soda cans on top of and that's stupid. There'd be absolutely no reason to take soda. If you're taking any liquid at all, it should be water. And in a scene a few minutes after this, they actually indicate that they don't have any water, which is absurd. You should certainly have had that be one of your first things to get, different types of water purification, fire starting shelters, or weapons, things like that. A little bit of a different scenario than just a pure, bug out live in the woods, because you also are thinking you might have to deal with hostile forces. So obviously the guns become even more important in that situation. But water, obviously, so important. When they're driving away from the gas station general store, Jed pulls a gun out of the glove box, asks his brother to check if it's loaded, which it is. Good, it should be if you're going to carry a gun around, and then puts it in his waistband and puts the shells in his pocket. A little late, if you ask me. I would have had that thing in my pocket immediately. Pretty much, I would have had it in my hand. But at the very least, he has a gun. Awesome. He gets it and makes it ready. Even better. Something that we don't see very often in these movies, unfortunately, is the characters are so dumb when it comes to actually getting armed and staying armed. Things like that. Another thing that he does well, almost immediately after this, is he notices a military roadblock fairly far out and stops pretty early and pulls off the road. As soon as he sees it, tries to turn around and get out of the way. They do start shooting at him from like what appears to be some kind of like APC kind of striker type vehicle, an armored personnel carrier or something like that with a machine gun on top, something Russian. And they're only saved when a U.S. chopper comes in. But at the very least, he did the right thing. And too often, again, in these movies, it shows people pull right up to a roadblock, start engaging with the people. And at that point, you have no chance of getting away. You would have to either turn around or back up from within, 10, 20 yards of everyone there. They could just light you up super easily. It takes way too long to turn around. You need to stop and notice the roadblock at the very least as far away as possible. And he does that, so that was a good thing on his part. Pull off the road. They're in a place where it's a lot of plains, so they don't have too much cover. But the chopper comes in and saves the day, and they manage to escape. But there's a hole punctured in the radiator from presumably a bullet. And this is where the no water comes into play because he manages to, it doesn't show how exactly, but he manages to patch the radiator. So he's got some good kind of skills there, mechanic skills, very handyman type skills. Much more common back in the day than nowadays, it seems like. Just general kind of skills at fixing and building and things like that. But he's a competent guy. He fixes the radiator, but didn't have any water to put in it. So, they're really their first major mistake that you can really identify is that didn't grab water. That's like rule number one, man. You gotta have water, even if it's not a ton. I mean, they're in Colorado. It's probably not nearly as scarce as it is here in the desert, but you have to have water. I mean, especially in a situation where you might be having to run or stay on the move because of enemy forces. You're not necessarily going to be able to just set up a really long-term camp. So they have someone piss in the radiator. And another thing that's funny about that is they have to actually have the guy stand up on the bumper and like physically piss into the radiator. And I don't think that's the best way to do it. You could try to use the soda, I guess, and put that in the radiator. The sugar might caramelize and mess it up. But if you're going to use piss, which would probably work, you just kind of need a lot of it. I would at least piss into some kind of container first and then be able to pour that into the radiator versus trying to aim your piss directly into the radiator. But whatever. Makes for an interesting scene. And it probably would work at least to get your car going a little bit further. So it doesn't show exactly where they leave the car, but they don't really use it much after that anyway once they go off and start living in the woods. So they didn't really need it to get that much farther. So certainly probably would have worked if you legitimately patched the radiator, but I would have pissed into a container first. Soon after that, they're all set up kind of in their camp, just kind of sitting around. The gravity of the situation is really hitting them. And it's another really good scene. It shows why the Jed character does things very well, at least up to this point and everything. Where one of the student body president characters, he's kind of this like sleazy politician type character whose dad is actually the mayor, says like, "Oh, we can't live out here. We need stuff." And they're being kind of whiny, and the Jed character's just like, "No, shut up." And he's like, "I, as student body president, I motion that we turn ourselves in." And Jed's just like, "No." And he's like, why don't we vote on it? And he's just like, "Sit down." And that's the smart thing. You can't have everything. We've talked about this actually in some of the Prepper Trifecta videos before. We can't have everything devolve into a committee. And he does the very smart thing. And he says, "No, here's your chance. You can leave. Take your stuff and go if you want. But if you stay here, you're going to listen to what I say." He does that very early on. Makes it clear. There's still problems from the Daryl character, the student body president, in the future. And if you haven't, this might be something you have to deal with. There's not a way to prevent 100% there from being any issues, but he did the best of his ability. He let people know this isn't going to be everyone voting on everything. You don't have to be here. You can go back on your own accord. But if you stay, this is how it's going to be. And that's really the only way you can do it in a situation like that. That is just has to be the way it is. And he does that. Smart decision on his part. And it allows them to have a pretty cohesive, pretty effective group from there on out. And it shows the dynamic. That's usually how it happens if you have a bunch of semi-reasonable men. In this case, they're teenagers, but still set the expectations early. There's a conflict, but it's open conflict that is squashed, and then they shake hands, and then it's over from there on out. The hierarchy's basically been set, and they don't have too many more problems up until an actual act of betrayal. And that's, like I said, that's the way you have to do it. Now, I'm not going to get into too much of all the rest of the movie. I'm going to point out a few specific things, because as they enter into their guerrilla kind of warfare battle against the Cuban/Russians, I'm not going to get into all the military tactics and stuff like that, because it's not really what this video is about. But I will point out a few specific things. In general, the idea, if you're going to go in some sort of campaign like that, is it's much smarter to go after soft logistical targets than it would be to go after, actual hardened military targets, armored convoys, things like that, because logistics is what everything is based off of. It doesn't matter if they have the baddest tanks and the most powerful rifles, if they don't have gas, if they don't have ammunition, if they don't have electricity, if they don't have water, if their people are sick or injured or underfed or whatever, then the whole system breaks down. That's the stuff that's easiest to attack, because it's a lot harder to protect. There's a lot more of it. It's something that even a small disruption can cause much more magnified ripples in the actual fighting capabilities. messing up their gas, their water supply, their transportation of supplies and food and things like that is a lot easier and causes a lot more problems than trying to actually just shoot a single soldier or actual units that are capable of defending themselves. So that's what your focus should be if you have to ever engage in some kind of guerrilla warfare. After about a month of living in their little camp in the woods, everyone decides they really want to know what's going on, so they venture back down into the town. Which it's not necessarily a bad idea to kind of try and go scope things out, but they end up just kind of stashing their weapons and just walking into the town, which is a terrible idea because it's very likely that these people would have had all sorts of different rules. The town is obviously under the Cuban/Russian control. They may have all sorts of rules and curfews that you don't know about, that if you break, you end up in some holding cell. They find one of the people who live there that knows them and actually confirms that the KGB or whatever police they have in the village are actively looking for them. So, it might be very difficult to get back out again. Not a smart idea to go into town like that without really knowing the situation. But luckily, they do manage to eventually somehow. It doesn't show exactly how. I guess they just go out on cover of night or whatever. But it kind of makes you wonder why all the other people are staying there. But, it probably is the way it would be in a situation like that. I don't think people would really. There's a lot of people who are just going to try and go back to whatever some normal life they can. They're not going to have that desire to really break free and risk it to escape. Then later they end up going to a neighbor, kind of a rural neighbor who's living far away from the city, and he gives them a few things, tells them about a couple people that had died. One of the characters, Robert's dad, they said that he's dead, and he ends up being one of the more kind of rugged, stalwart characters in their little group from that point on, where he kind of hardens his resolve and becomes more of a badass and one of the more trustworthy ones. And this guy sends his granddaughters with the group. So it's the two women, Jennifer Grey and Leah Thompson, I think. And so they go. It's the first women to be in the group, which obviously I believe would cause some drama, probably. And it does cause a little bit, nothing too crazy. You see, that it shows in the movie, but especially when you have people of that age. For the most part, the Jed character does a pretty good job with the leadership role. Doesn't allow too much crazy shit to happen. So he's got, they got that going for him, which is nice. They also give them horses, which could be very useful in a situation like that. The interesting thing is they would be, in my opinion, extremely difficult to take care of in a situation where you just have kind of a campsite in the woods with semi-permanent structures and whatnot. You're going to have to find somewhere to put these horses, some way to get them water and enough food. Could be very difficult and labor intensive. So they don't really get into that. It doesn't even show how they're really keeping the horses, but they would be useful in a situation, obviously. But I think it would be very logistically difficult to take care of them. Their first taste of actual combat comes when they, I believe, accidentally come across a small group of soldiers who are out basically exploring the national forest. Don't think there's any activity in the area. It's just three guys, and they're accidentally discovered, sort of falling down a hill, and the troops come after them, and they manage to get one of the guys with an arrow and end up killing the other two as well. And so they realize that they can actually get some of these people, and it doesn't show what they do with their resources. Presumably they're taking it, because it does show later in the movie that they have more weapons and everything, which is one of the things they do that's very good, is you want to take all the resources. And nowadays you would have to worry more about being tracked potentially. Back in the mid-'80s, obviously the vehicles aren't going to have any sort of low jack or anything like that in them. Communications are much more rudimentary, just radios and things like that, so you don't have as much of a risk of being found out. And nowadays it would be a pretty trivial matter for them to fly over the forest with like FLIR or thermal and just find your camp, in the blink of an eye and wipe it out. And they didn't have to worry about that back then. But even with helicopters and things like that, it would be much more easy to camouflage your position and remain undetected. Nowadays, you would have a really hard time. That's why the only way that guerrillas are normally able to effectively fight somebody like the U.S. or one of these bigger countries is when they're mixed into the population, not when they're in isolated rural areas, because then it's too easy to find them and too easy to just blow them up with no collateral damage. It's when you're mixed in with the normal population and they can't just level the whole city. That's the way you would have to do it. And they do some of that as well. It shows that they use the girls in particular because they're, viewed less threateningly to leave some bombs and things like that. And it shows them once at a gas station too. They go and they somehow predict, I guess, that the guys are going to steal from the girl, and there's a bomb in the basket and it blows up their tank. But again, like they're at a gas station. It would be much better to somehow either sabotage the gas itself or just destroy the gas station and say, sorry guys, this is, we have to do kind of a scorched earth policy here to take these guys out and just eliminate any of the resources that they can use. You'd have to weigh that against, turning the whole population of the city against you by destroying their resources as well. But someone like the gas station attendant could, do things to sabotage the gas or sabotage the vehicles or the food or other things like that. And that would probably be more effective in modern times where they, have an easier ability to take out kind of rural guerrillas than they did back in the day. After the initial, one of the initial conflicts, the Robert character saws off his shotgun, which I don't think would be a very, very, intelligent to do in a situation like this. There's just no reason to. You're not in a situation where you need to carry anything concealed. In your pretty conventional military situation, I think the additional range of a full-length barrel would be much more useful, and you could carry it almost as easily as one with a sawed-off barrel. So a few extra inches is really not going to make that much of a difference in carrying it. So I wouldn't have done that. I think it's more of a movie trope than anything else. But yeah, it wouldn't really make sense to me in that situation. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to go into too much specifics of all their military engagements because I don't want this to turn into like a military tactics type video, which I'm not an expert on anyway. I have some training in small unit tactics and things like that, but the general survival lessons and things like that are happening earlier in the movie for the first half of the movie. After that, it turns into like the guerrilla warfare type stuff. And just the general principles, like I said, I would go after the soft targets. It shows them shooting like a lineman, fixing the cables, electrical cables or communication cables. That sort of stuff is intelligent. At one point, it shows them an ambush, and it's halfway through the ambush before they set off RPGs or set off claymores and shoot an RPG. In general, you want to initiate the ambush with your most casualty producing weapon for a couple reasons. First of all, it guarantees that you'll get to use it. If a guy with an RPG, as soon as the ambush starts, he might get shot or something like that. And also, you get to use it when they're least defensive. They're not in a defensive position. They haven't dropped down behind cover. They're not shooting back at you. So it gets the maximum amount of casualties when they're least protected, and then their defensive capabilities are going to be as decreased as possible from the get-go. If you can take out their biggest weapon or the largest group of people with the first shot of the ambush, that's really useful and will improve your chances of completely destroying them and taking limited casualties. So that's what you want to do. In most cases, you want to lead with your most casualty-producing weapons right off the bat. And that's what you should be doing. Another thing that they did that was very smart was when they kind of make a attack on the re-education camp where all the troublemakers are being held, and sort of a prison camp for the people who they think were causing trouble in the town, any sort of leaders or dissidents or anything like that. And they bring a ton of captured weapons to hand out. Instead of trying to just break everyone out and either letting them run free or take them away in a truck, they just literally arm them and say, now's your chance, go and fight, which is extremely smart. It makes them a lot more formidable of a force pretty instantly. You now have 10 times as many people armed. Also, it makes you less likely to take casualties in your small group of the Wolverines, which was their school team, so that's what they go by. Because now they have all these other armed people to deal with. And it just makes it a lot bigger of a problem for the bad guys to deal with. So that was pretty intelligent of them to do as well. There is one point where the Daryl kid apparently had gone back into town. You don't see this happening. His dad's the mayor and has been sort of working as like a liaison between the people and the new leadership of the Soviets and the Cubans. And Daryl goes back into town. Apparently his dad turns him in, makes him swallow a bug, and they use that to find the camp. Luckily, somehow the Wolverines have defenses already set up, and they catch the guys. They defeat the attack, and then they're left with the decision of what to do with Daryl, who betrayed them. And that's something you have to consider. We've talked about the rules for your groups before. You might have to create some sort of justice system, what to do with someone who's betrayed you. You can't just let this person continue in your group. If you exile them, they have all the information about where you are, what you're doing, how you do things, how many people you have, how many weapons you have. So can you just let them go if they've already betrayed you? Are you willing and able to just execute them? Things like that. So that's something that you might have to deal with in a crazy situation like this. From a prepping perspective and survival perspective, most of the rest of the movie is just, like I said, basically the military aspects. They don't show too much about how their little camp operated, how they have it set up in terms of the trains and resource management. It does show them hunting earlier on in the movie with the Jed and Matt characters have been coming out in the woods. They were, accomplished woodsmen, hunters, which is extremely useful skill to have in the situation. Jed also mentions earlier in the movie about not shooting twice because then someone can triangulate your position more easily. If you hear one gunshot, it's very difficult to tell exactly where it came from. And if you don't hear any others, then it's almost impossible in most situations with echoes and things like that. But if you hear a second one, it becomes a lot easier to narrow down your position. So they know how to hunt, things like that. And some of the resource management stuff, like they is one of the issues that they do. Not terribly, but they execute some people. They do end up executing Daryl. They almost decide not to, but then the Robert character shoots him anyway. But then they leave their boots on. They leave their uniforms on them and everything. That's useful things. That's useful inventory, gear, whatever you want to call it. That in a situation like that where you're living in the woods, fighting a guerrilla battles, every little thing would be super important like that, especially in a winter situation. And a couple other things they initially in the movie they were very, very bad about doing any sort of camouflage, just walking around in basically civilian clothes, stick out like a sore thumb. Matt is the first one it shows with some kind of rudimentary ghillie suit when he's going through some tall grass and he has a suit made out of the grass. That's very good thing to do. One thing you want to keep in mind when using any sort of ghillie suit or found camouflage is to make the pieces too long, because he has grass on him, and if you have long grasses or pieces of twigs and branches sticking up off of you, any minor movement makes a lot of movement at the ends. So you want to use the same type of vegetation, but keep the pieces small so that when you move, only the pieces that are directly on you are moving and there's no additional kind of sway. Because if you have some, tall grass on you and you're even crawling, there's going to be a lot of movement up in the grass. So even if they don't physically see you or see the movement of you crawling, there's going to be a lot of rustling of your camouflage suit, basically. So he should have cut the grass pieces a little bit shorter, but otherwise very good idea there. And later in the movie where they wear predominantly white, it's good in a snow situation. That's all you really need for snow camouflage. A lot of times you'll see that urban camouflage was originally called or winter camouflage or something like that, or vice versa maybe, but a lot of people call it snow camouflage, where it's white, black, and gray. The best camouflage for someplace that's actually very snowy is usually just solid white, because there's so much white out there that even if there is other colors, there's no need for you to have those other colors on you. There will be enough breaking it up anyway, shadows and things like that, that just a patch of white that matches the snow is very difficult to pick out and is usually your best bet when it comes to snow camouflage. And if not, just covering yourself actually with snow if you have the opportunity. So by the end of the movie, most of their group have actually been killed. There's a few left. A couple of them decide to make a break for the free territory. The other side of the line is a part of the U.S. that has been stabilized under U.S. control. And Matt and Jed try to make a last-ditch attack on the Calumet, which is a town, the big military base that's set up by the communists there, and go out in a blaze of glory, basically. So really cool movie overall, one of the all-time greats, and hopefully I've done it justice. I've been sick for a few days, so this video is not as good as I was hoping it would be. Interested to see what JJ and Che come up with. And like I mentioned before, a lot of the lessons and things to be learned in this aren't necessarily from a prepping perspective. They'd be more for a insurgency or guerrilla warfare type stuff. But particularly in the first portions of the movie, there's some really cool scenes that are definitely applicable for shit the fan scenarios with the bugging out and the resource acquisition, living in the wilderness, things like that. So let me know what you guys think about this movie if you've seen it, your thoughts on what they did well, what they did right, things like that. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will talk to you later.